The sun burned over a small Texas town where the wind carried dust and history together. A convoy of trucks rolled in, filled with captured German soldiers, still defiant despite defeat. Their laughter echoed through the heat, mocking the sight of wide hats and weathered faces. They were prisoners now, but their pride marched before them like an invisible flag. "So, these are America's warriors?" one of them sneered, pointing at the sheriff waiting by the station steps. The others chuckled, whispering jokes about cowboys and pistols. Sheriff William Hayes stood motionless, his hand resting casually near his revolver. He was a man of few words, his expression carved from years of quiet authority. The Germans saw a small-town lawman. What they didn't see was a former Marine. To them, he looked like a caricature. Wide-brimmed hat, badge glinting in the light, boots dusty from the road. They mistook simplicity for weakness and calm for ignorance. Their arrogance filled the air thicker than the summer heat. When Hayes ordered them off the truck, his voice was steady, low and commanding. The interpreter barely finished translating before the Germans started laughing again. They moved lazily, dragging their feet, testing the patience of a man they thought was harmless. One of them spat near the sheriff's boots and smirked. The crowd of locals watching from the sidewalk fell silent, their eyes fixed on the lawman's face. Hayes didn't move, but the tension that followed could have cracked glass. He stepped forward once, his boots thudding softly on the ground. "In this town," he said evenly, "we treat even prisoners with respect, if they earn it." The Germans stopped smiling, unsure if they were being warned or forgiven. The interpreter hesitated to repeat the line, but the sheriff nodded, insisting he translate it word for word. When he did, something shifted in the prisoner's posture. For the first time, the laughter faltered, replaced by a wary silence. A gust of wind lifted the American flag hanging behind Hayes, snapping it sharply in the dry air. The sound cut through the quiet like a whip. The Germans looked at the revolver on his hip, polished, heavy, and suddenly not so funny. Hayes turned slowly, his shadow stretching long across the dust. His eyes met theirs with a cold, unshakable calm that soldiers recognized too well. He wasn't just a sheriff anymore. He was command, judgment, and control. One prisoner muttered, "Cowboy," but the word carried no laughter this time. Hayes holstered his revolver and said softly, "Out here. Cowboy means peacekeeper." The meaning hit them harder than any threat could. He walked back toward his office, leaving the prisoners to unload their own supplies in silence. The locals nodded approvingly, knowing what restraint truly cost a man like Hayes. Power wasn't in the gun. It was in the hand that chose not to use it. As the trucks drove off toward the camp, the prisoners kept glancing at the sheriff's empty doorway. None spoke, but every man carried the same thought. Maybe they realized these cowboys were not men to laugh at after all, because the next time the sheriff reached for that revolver, it wouldn't be to warn them. It would be to teach them what real discipline looked like. The POW camp sat just outside town, fenced by barbed wire, and guarded by men who looked more like ranchers than soldiers. The German prisoners quickly realized this wasn't a typical military post. Everything here ran on respect, not fear. Sheriff Hayes visited daily, riding in on his horse with the slow confidence of a man who'd seen war up close. He didn't bark orders or carry a rifle, just that single revolver on his hip. To the Germans, it seemed symbolic, almost ceremonial. But when a brawl broke out near the mess hall one morning, that symbol came alive. Two prisoners were fighting over rations, fists flying, guards shouting helplessly. Hayes stepped in without hesitation, moving like a man who didn't need backup. The Germans stopped mid-fight when they saw the revolver in his hand. The sheriff didn't aim it. He simply held it with a steady ease that froze the entire yard. The laughter that once filled the camp now died in their throats. "Put him down," Hayes said quietly, and the prisoner obeyed before the interpreter even spoke. His voice carried the weight of a soldier, not a sheriff. It was the tone of someone who'd been obeyed under fire. When the camp commander arrived, he found the fight already over, and the men standing in rigid silence. "You handled it well, Sheriff," he said. Hayes simply replied, "A man with honor don't need chains to behave." That afternoon, the prisoners talked among themselves in hushed tones. They spoke of the revolver, the calmness, the authority that came without threats. For the first time, they compared him not to a cowboy, but to a commander. Some even asked the guards about Hayes's past, curious what kind of man led with silence. They learned he'd served in the Pacific, seen combat, and earned medals he never mentioned. It changed the way they looked at his badge forever. Later that evening, one of the younger prisoners approached him as he checked the perimeter. "You fought in the war?" he asked timidly. Hayes nodded, saying only, "Long enough to know nobody wins one." The German lowered his eyes, ashamed by his earlier arrogance. "Then why carry that revolver?" he asked. The sheriff smiled faintly. "Because some men only listen when they see the truth shining." The prisoner didn't understand at first, but the image stayed with him, the revolver glinting in the sunset, steady, unshaken. It wasn't a weapon anymore. It was discipline made visible. From that day, laughter gave way to quiet respect. When Hayes left the camp that night, the guards noticed the prisoners stood straighter. They saluted, not because they had to, but because something in them finally recognized strength without cruelty. The sheriff rode home under the orange Texas sky, the revolver heavy at his side. To him, it wasn't about power. It was about peace earned through restraint. And the prisoners, once mockers, now whispered about the lawman who never needed to draw first. Because they had seen enough to understand. Real power didn't come from the gun. It came from the man steady enough to hold it and still choose mercy. Among the prisoners was Captain Erich Weiss, once a proud officer of the Wehrmacht. He carried himself like a man who refused to accept defeat. To him, respect was a prize to be won, not freely given. He watched the sheriff closely every day, studying his mannerisms, his silence, the revolver that never left his side. To Weiss, this calmness wasn't discipline. It was weakness. He told the others, "A man who fears to use his weapon has already lost." The others warned him to let it go, but pride was louder than reason. So one hot afternoon, as Hayes supervised the prisoners unloading lumber, Weiss decided to test the legend. "Cowboy," he called out mockingly, "oh, show us if your gun even works." The guards tensed, hands near their rifles, but Hayes didn't move. He looked up slowly, his eyes narrowing against the sunlight. "You sure you want to find out?" he asked softly, like a man giving mercy one last chance. Weiss smirked and kicked over a water barrel, the sound echoing across the yard. "You hide behind fear," he said in broken English. "A German officer would face his enemy." Hayes stepped forward, each boot sinking slightly in the dirt. The camp fell silent, even the wind seemed to pause. He unbuckled his holster strap, but didn't draw. "You think the gun makes the man," Hayes said evenly, voice carrying across the yard. "But a man who needs it to prove something ain't one." Weiss's smirk wavered for the first time. Then, in one smooth motion, Hayes drew the revolver and fired into the ground near Weiss's boot. The sound cracked like thunder, dirt flying into the officer's face. He didn't flinch again. He froze. Every prisoner watched, breathless, the echo ringing off the fence. The sheriff's hand didn't shake. His eyes stayed calm as still water. "Now, you've seen it works," Hayes said. "You done testing me?" Wise didn't answer. The arrogance had drained from his face, replaced by something far heavier, understanding. He nodded once quietly and stepped back. Hayes holstered his revolver with the same slow grace as before. "You don't have to fear me," he said. "Just don't make me prove I'm not the man you think I am." The words cut deeper than the shot ever could. When the guards led Weiss away, he didn't look back. The German soldiers were silent for the rest of the day. They had laughed at cowboys once, but now they'd seen a man who didn't need a badge to command fear. As the sun dipped below the horizon, the camp lights flickered on, casting long shadows. In the distance, the sheriff stood alone by the gate, the revolver glinting faintly in his hand. That night, the Germans finally understood what real discipline looked like. And though Hayes said nothing more, his silence told them everything. They were no longer laughing because they had finally met a man who didn't have to prove his strength to own it. The next morning came quiet, the kind of silence that carried meaning. The prisoners moved with a new rhythm, orderly, alert, respectful. Even Weiss nodded politely when the sheriff passed. Hayes noticed the change but said nothing. He didn't need to. Respect that was forced never lasted. Respect that was earned never faded. The camp gates creaked open as the supply truck arrived under the sharp Texas sun. The driver, a young soldier barely 20, misjudged his turn and toppled a crate of nails across the yard. Without hesitation, 3 German POWs ran to help him pick them up. The guards looked on, unsure whether to stop them or thank them. Hayes watched from the shade, his revolver resting on his belt but untouched. In that small act of help, something deeper shifted. The first crack in the wall between enemies. Later that day, Hayes joined them for inspection, walking slowly along the rows of prisoners. He caught Weiss's eye and gave a short nod. To his surprise, the officer nodded back, the smallest hint of a smile ghosting his face. "Strange world," Weiss muttered in English, "to respect the man who beat you without firing at you." Hayes tilted his hat. "That's the only way worth winning, son," he replied. In the mess hall, laughter returned. Not mocking this time, but real. The guards shared coffee with the prisoners. A few even traded cigarettes. Somewhere between war and peace, men started remembering they were human again. That night, a storm swept across the camp, tearing through one of the fences. Guards rushed to fix it, fearing an escape. But when morning came, every prisoner was still there. No one had tried to run. They knew freedom given by respect meant more than freedom stolen by fear. Hayes saw it too, and for the first time in months he smiled. A week later, a Red Cross official visited and remarked how calm the camp was. "Discipline here seems voluntary," he said. Hayes simply answered, "That's what happens when you treat men like they still got souls." Word spread through nearby camps about the sheriff who ran his post like a town, not a prison. Other officers visited just to watch how he managed order without cruelty. Weiss later told them quietly, "He governs by dignity, not power." When mail arrived, Hayes made sure every letter was delivered personally. He knew what a man's words from home could mean. The prisoners saw it too, and began tipping their caps to him every morning. One afternoon, Weiss approached with a request. "Sheriff," he said, "when this war ends, will we still be enemies?" Hayes looked him in the eyes and replied, "Only if you decide to be." And for the first time since capture, Weiss smiled, not as a soldier, but as a man finally free from pride. Respect had replaced fear, and the camp had become something more than confinement. It had become redemption. Summer drifted toward its end, and the Texas sky grew heavy with heat and waiting. The radio in the guardhouse crackled with news every man longed and feared to hear. The war was ending, they said, but nobody cheered. The German prisoners gathered quietly by the fence as the American flag fluttered above them. For months, that flag had been a symbol of defeat. Now, under its shadow, it felt more like forgiveness. Sheriff Hayes stood before them, hat in hand, revolver holstered and silent as always. "War's over," he said softly. "Guess we can all stop pretending we don't respect each other." Some of the men laughed, others looked away, unsure how to feel. One guard whispered, "They don't seem happy to be free." Hayes replied, "Freedom's hard when it comes with shame." Weiss stepped forward, shoulders squared, eyes clear. "You fought fair," he said in his rough English. "That's something my war never taught me." Hayes extended his hand slowly, waiting. The German captain hesitated only a second before taking it. In that brief handshake, years of hate dissolved into something older and stronger. Honor. The guards watched silently as other prisoners followed, one by one shaking the sheriff's hand. No orders were given, no ceremony announced. It was simply men recognizing the humanity they had once buried beneath uniforms. When the Red Cross trucks arrived to begin transfers, nobody rushed to leave. Some lingered at the gates, scanning the dusty horizon. Weiss turned back one last time and saluted, not as a prisoner, but as an equal. Hayes returned the salute, his face calm, eyes steady beneath the brim of his hat. "You take care of yourself, son," he said. "And don't forget what respect looks like when you see it again." The engines roared and the trucks rolled away, kicking up clouds of red dust. The camp fell silent again, emptier than it had ever been. But to Hayes, it didn't feel like loss. It felt like a promise kept. That evening, the sheriff rode out to the edge of town where the sun met the fields. The revolver hung at his side, untouched, gleaming faintly in the light. He thought of all the men who'd feared it, and how none of them ever needed to. He dismounted, removed his hat, and stood alone beneath the fading sky. "Guess we all got our lessons," he murmured to the wind. "Mine was that peace ain't weakness. It's courage without noise." As night settled over the empty camp, Hayes walked back slowly, his shadow stretching long across the dirt. The war had ended, but something purer had survived within those fences. For the Germans and for the sheriff, it was the same lesson. True strength never fires first. And though history would forget the little camp outside Texas, those who lived it would never forget the man who taught them that even behind barbed wire, dignity could still wear a badge. Months passed and the war faded into headlines, then into memory. The German prisoners returned to a homeland in ruins, cities burned, families scattered, honor lost in the rubble. Yet for many, their clearest memory of America wasn't the barbed wire. It was Sheriff Hayes. Weiss walked the streets of Dresden, a city reduced to ash, carrying only a satchel and a folded photograph. It wasn't of comrades or battlefields, but of the camp, men smiling beside their American guards. In a world shattered by cruelty, that small image felt like proof that goodness had survived. Years later, Weiss became a teacher. He refused to glorify the war or the men who started it. Instead, he told his students, "The strongest man I ever met wore a sheriff's badge and never fired his gun in anger." He wrote to the Red Cross, asking for any record of the camp in Texas. The letter found its way, months later, to a quiet office in the United States. A clerk read it, smiled faintly, and sent it on to the sheriff's station in Haskell County. When Hayes received it, the envelope was worn, edges yellowed by distance and time. Inside, the words were simple. You taught us how to lose like men and live like humans again. The sheriff folded the letter carefully and placed it in his jacket pocket. He didn't show it to anyone, not even his deputies. But every evening after patrol, he'd sit on the porch, take out that letter, and read it again in the fading light. The handwriting was foreign, but the gratitude was universal. The years were kind to Hayes, though his hair turned silver, and his revolver grew more a symbol than a weapon. People said he was the kind of man who carried quiet storms behind calm eyes. He never denied it, just said the war had taught him how to measure silence. Once, a young journalist from Dallas came to interview him about the cowboy who changed German POWs. Hayes just laughed softly. There weren't cowboys and prisoners, he said. Just men learning how not to hate. In Germany, veterans began sharing stories of their time in American camps. Most spoke of food, safety, and dignity, things they hadn't expected. But one story kept resurfacing. A sheriff in Texas who taught respect with a revolver he never needed to fire. By the 1950s, those stories became part of quiet legend among former soldiers. They said he represented the side of America they never understood. The side that could fight hard but still forgive. The side that won wars without losing its soul. Weiss eventually sent one final letter, years later, not knowing if Hayes still lived. You showed us, it read, that honor can exist without victory and mercy without weakness. It was signed simply, from the man who laughed first. Hayes received it on a spring afternoon, long after his badge had dulled. He read it twice, leaned back, and looked toward the sunset stretching over the plains. Guess laughter ain't so bad, he said softly, as long as you end it with respect. The sheriff folded the letter, placed it beside the first, and locked both in his desk drawer. He never told anyone what they said. Some lessons, he believed, were meant to be carried quietly to the grave. And when he finally passed years later, those letters were found, yellowed, fragile, but powerful enough to make the men who read them understand what history had forgotten, that victory can come from the heart as much as from the gun. Decades later, the war was just ink on pages and fading photographs. But for two families, one in Texas, one in Munich, the story wasn't over yet. It still breathed quietly through the letters their fathers had written. In 1972, a young journalist named Sarah Hayes traveled to Germany. She carried with her her father's old badge and two yellowed envelopes. They were the only relics she had of a man who believed in mercy more than might. In Munich, she met a woman named Elsa Weiss, a teacher with gentle eyes and her father's same calm posture. They spoke for hours in a small cafe, words weaving between English and German. Each story they shared mirrored the other, different lands, same lesson. Elsa showed Sarah a black and white photo taken at the camp. In it, her father stood beside an American in a sheriff's hat. Sarah felt her breath catch. She had seen that same hat resting on her father's chair since childhood. Neither woman spoke for a long time, the silence holding more truth than any words could. The past had brought them together across oceans. What their fathers began with a handshake, they were finishing with understanding. Later they visited the old site of the POW camp, now an open field of tall grass. Only the wind seemed to remember, but in that stillness both women felt a strange peace, as if the land itself was proud of its history. Sarah took out the badge and placed it gently on a small stone. He'd like that, Elsa whispered softly. The two women smiled through tears, each realizing their fathers had passed them something stronger than blood, a shared sense of decency. They spent hours walking the grounds, tracing invisible lines of fences long gone. Sarah imagined her father standing there, hat low, revolver gleaming in the Texas sun. Elsa pictured her own father laughing, not in arrogance this time, but in awe. Before parting, Sarah handed Elsa one of the old letters. "Half this story belongs to you," she said quietly. Elsa nodded, clutching it to her chest as though it were sacred. Back in Texas, Sarah placed the last letter beside her father's photo on the mantel. The ink had faded, but the words remained powerful as ever. "We learned to be men," it said, because one man never stopped being human. The sheriff's revolver hung above that photo, untouched for decades. People often asked why she never sold it. Sarah always answered the same: because it never fired the shot that mattered most. That winter, Elsa mailed her a package, a copy of her father's journal, translated into English. Inside was one final line that tied both legacies together. "Respect can end a war longer than peace can." Sarah framed the quote and hung it beside her father's letter. Every time she passed, she smiled. The world had turned many times since that Texas summer, but the lesson had stayed still. And though the world had moved on from cowboys and wars, one truth remained timeless: strength that needs no violence lasts longer than victory itself. By the 1980s, history books began to rediscover the Texas POW camps. But few knew the quiet story behind one sheriff and the men who once mocked him. A documentary crew arrived in Haskell County, searching for remnants of the camp. All they found was wind, open sky, and a small memorial stone. Locals told them about Sheriff Hayes, the man who never raised his gun but never lost control. They said he ruled by respect, not fear, and even his prisoners cried when he left. The filmmakers played old interviews from former POWs still alive in Germany. Their voices trembled, but their eyes lit up when they said his name. One man whispered, "He was the only enemy who treated us like brothers." Another said, "I learned freedom from the man who kept me behind wire." The documentary aired across Europe, reaching millions who had never heard the tale. For the first time, the world saw that compassion had worn a badge in the wartime America. In classrooms, teachers showed clips of the sheriff's calm authority. Students who had grown up on stories of cruelty learned that kindness could win battles too. Historians began calling Hayes the silent sheriff. They said he represented the moral strength of America, unyielding, fair, and human. At the Texas History Museum, a small exhibit was created in his honor. Inside a glass case lay his revolver, his hat, and a letter signed by Erich Weiss. Visitors read the words and stood silent. The letter ended simply, "He taught us to stop hating before we went home." Outside the exhibit, a bronze plaque bore a single inscription: "Respect is mightier than fear." Veterans from both nations came each year to pay tribute. Some saluted, others prayed, but all left with the same quiet awe. The sheriff never lived to see any of it, but his message outlived him by generations. The men who once laughed now taught their grandchildren why they stopped. And in that lesson, told through silence, mercy, and one steady revolver, America's true power was finally understood. Decades after the war, the sheriff's story became something larger than history. It became identity. His quiet strength came to represent the America the world had forgotten existed. Foreign journalists wrote that he won peace with the same hands that could draw a gun. They called him the cowboy who carried conscience instead of bullets. In Germany, young cadets studied his story in ethics courses. They learned that victory without humanity is hollow, and mercy can be stronger than vengeance. American veterans who had once fought in the Pacific wrote letters to his family. "We thought we were fighting monsters," one said. but men like him reminded us we weren't supposed to become them. The sheriff's old revolver became a symbol not of war, but of restraint. Its holster, cracked and faded, was displayed under the words, "Used only when silence failed." When tourists asked if the weapon had ever taken a life, guides would smile softly. No, they'd answer. But it gave life back to many who'd lost it inside. Scholars debated whether his compassion was discipline or defiance. To most, it didn't matter because either way, it worked. He embodied a truth America rarely spoke of, that its greatest victories came not from firepower, but from decency. The sheriff's legend spread because it reminded people what real power looked like. One historian wrote, "He fought for no side but humanity's." Those words became engraved beneath his photo in the archives of the Texas Historical Society. In the photo, Hayes stands under a vast sky, hand resting on his revolver, eyes calm. You can almost hear the silence, the kind that demands respect. His legacy traveled further than bullets ever could. From Europe to Asia, his name was whispered by soldiers who believed decency was weakness until they saw it win. In a divided world, his story offered something rare,